we're going to have our panel on climate change and economy, impacts, risks, and strategic thinking for the future. To chair this panel is a member of our executive committee, Richard O. Cunningham, international trade partner at Steptoe & Johnson. Dick has been a long-time supporter and member of our executive committee. He's one of the leading international trade lawyers in our country. He's always traveling off to places like China and South Korea and Japan. He just spoke yesterday on Brexit and China trade issues, and he's here today to lead this panel. Dick.
Is that working? Okay, thank you, Steve. The British television show Monty Python's Flying Circus always used to begin with John Cleese sitting at a table like this with a microphone like this, and he would say, "And now for something completely different." And this will be different. We have talked about climate change and what it is. We've talked about the broad binational and national policy issues of climate change. But lots of things that are going on at climate change take place at the state level, at regional levels, and among the corporations of Canada and the United States that have to deal with these issues. And we have a panel to address this major issue from those standpoints. I'm going to introduce, and by the way, we have a particular, unique, only get this from CUSLI aspect to this panel, which I will tell you about. We have three panelists who couldn't be better for this purpose. David Terry has 25 years of experience on wind, solar, and other energy issues. He's executive director of the National Association of State Energy Officials. He participates in energy policy discussions at the highest levels at Congress, at the White House, and internationally. Grant Goodrich, hometown boy makes good, is director of the Great Lakes Energy Institute here at Case Western. Previously, he managed the international research projects of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And earlier in his life, he was an Olmsted Scholar and studied international relations at Slovenia. I mentioned that last for a particular reason that I'll explain in a moment. And finally, Carlos Vassarés will present some perspectives from the private sector. He is a low-carbon energy entrepreneur with particular focus on emerging process efficiency technologies, on innovation fuels, and on specialty chemicals produced from waste. He is of Latvian descent and serves as vice chair of the Latvian Credit Union. And therefore, I can confidently say this is the only climate change panel that will bring you perspectives of both Slovenia and Latvia. So let me turn it first over to David. I don't think you have to press the button. So
Terrific.
I think we're automated here.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dick. As Dick mentioned, I'm the executive director of the National Association of State Energy Officials. And just to give you a moment of a lens of sort of where I'm coming from or how I view things, our members are the 50 governors, energy directors around the country. We represent all of them as well as the territories. They have an economic lens as much as an energy lens. These are not regulators. These are folks that are developing policies. The typical governor, after life, health, and safety, is worried about jobs and the economy in an energy context. So I guess I would say, in short, our members have been at this confluence of climate, energy technology, and the economy for the last 30 or so years. We've been heading that direction. I think we are finally there in earnest. And I guess the other pre-comment to my remarks is that there are some people that are glass half empty, some are glass half full. Fair warning, I tend to be glass overflowing, so it is an upbeat message for the states. There were really three areas that I wanted to hit on. A little bit is the context of climate, environment, and energy technologies and where we've been. For a very long time, many of the states didn't say the word climate. There were political connotations to it that were challenging. At the same time, they were moving energy policy ahead in many places in pretty fascinating ways from an economic development perspective and also from a climate perspective, even though we really didn't think of it that way. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Secondly, some of the things that we see on the horizon right now Just the change that has occurred in the last 6 to 12 months, both politically and economically in some of the states, I think are worth touching on. And then lastly, a little bit about what we see coming down the pike in the relatively near term that I think is worth thinking about in terms of climate, clean technology policy, economic development, and some of the costs associated with it. I guess at the outset, when I think about clean tech and climate and innovation, in the late 80s, early 90s, our organization started one of the first combined government, state government, federal government, private sector clean tech and investment programs that has never been around. It was early risk capital and venture capital before venture capital really called clean tech clean tech. It didn't go very well. It wasn't very successful, quite frankly. We learned a lot from it. We did it differently 10 years later, but we invested in things like trying to make wind power cheaper through various technological investments, trying to improve various materials involved in efficiency in manufacturing and so forth, a whole variety of things. And some good things came out of it. From a commercial perspective, not so much. About 10 years later, in the mid-90s, we started a joint cooperative research, development, demonstration, and investment program among states, the private sector, and the federal government. And it was focused on particular clean tech areas. Again, we didn't call it clean tech, but it involved very high-end building efficiency technologies, transportation, chemicals, et cetera. A few of the things that came out of that are interesting. The country's first plug-in electric hybrid school bus came through a joint investment between the state of Ohio's Energy Office, North Carolina, Washington State, Oregon, New York State, and the Department of Energy and a couple of private sector companies. And that model is still on the road today. So that was sort of the second round of, we weren't really aligning policy very well, but we were trying to align research and development and demonstration dollars. And I think we had some good success. So there's this past kind of collaborative activity that I'm going to return to at the end of my remarks that I think are relevant for some of the challenges we have today. The other piece that was happening at the same time were policy actions by the states. We haven't had a federal climate policy, as everybody knows, in any serious way. About 15 years ago, at an ASIO meeting, I made a very flippant remark. It wasn't intended to be. It got a little bit of a laugh, and it got me in a little bit of trouble, but I'll say it again for context. The Congress, the U.S. Congress, would probably act on climate in a serious way when we had a polar bear on an ice cube in the Potomac River. And you know, it was meant for effect, and it really wasn't meant to be disrespectful, but we tend to act at a crisis level at the federal level, even as states move forward. And we think often of the Californias, the New Yorks, et cetera, that are maybe taking progressive actions in this area for quite a number of years. But there are other states as well, and I think they're instructive about how we move forward. If you look at Iowa, Governor Branstad, who left a couple of years ago to be ambassador to China, longest serving governor in the country, he started in the late 80s with the first renewable electricity standard in the country. It was voluntary, but it was the first one. You fast forward, he was a great energy governor. Iowa has no discernible coal, natural gas, or oil. He knew that. He understood the economic implications of it. He also understood the environmental attributes of some of the technologies and resources they had in the energy space. That led to the policies that supported ethanol development. Iowa produced 40% of its electricity last year from wind, and now they're moving forward with solar with Governor Reynolds' leadership. Places that you don't expect. We see the same thing in Texas with wind and with storage and a variety of other areas. And I point those out only because those haven't been done under a climate umbrella, but they've been critically important to moving those states forward. And when we look at where things are, oops, is that it? Sure. Is that it? Okay, I can move. Okay, at any rate, I'll try to speak up. The other points I would make are more recent. We see a number of states now moving in new areas of grid optimization activities. North Carolina, for example, is looking at their grid in earnest. The new governor has called for a climate plan, which the energy director is undertaking there. Massachusetts is moving full bore on offshore wind, as is nearly every state from Virginia north to Maine. This is a tremendous resource. The early leaders in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, some of the other states are bringing the costs down rapidly. So the opportunities that we see that are all happening at the state level in technology are economically driven. I think the climate crisis and the cost associated with it our ability to solve those are not only dependent upon international relationships and coordination, for example, between Canada and the U.S., but on our ability to turn ourselves, our companies, our states into technology leaders. So this technology policy virtuous circle that we see at the state level, we think is critically important to support. The other thing that I wanted to focus on a little bit is looking forward. The election last November left us with 22 new governors, a number of returning governors. When we did our list of where energy policy and the governor commitments that were made during the campaigns are, 26 of the governors have some combination of 100% renewable goals, 80% renewable goals, large climate goals, zero emission vehicle goals in their campaigns that they ran. They're headed that direction. Whether the state will or not, we shall see. But that's more than half the states. It's not the geography on the coast. It's much broader. We had that change last year, which I think changed politically also in Congress. Irrespective of the change in leadership of the House to the Democrats, there was a change in the air. I think there is finally that movement at the national level that I referenced earlier about the polar bear. I think we are seeing that shift. And it's that alignment between federal and state policy that has been missing that we hope that we move toward. And I think that we'll see more of that. What we are hearing from our members, from private sector companies that we deal with, are to better align research, development, demonstrations. So we have states that are doing that now. Florida, for example, they're coordinating their public research institutions, clean tech research on a regular basis. Where are their strengths, weaknesses? Where can they draw on private dollars? Where can they draw on federal dollars, et cetera? We see it in workforce. We just completed the third installment of the U.S. Energy Employment Report at NASEO. This is something we do in combination with the Energy Futures Initiative. That's an organization operated by former Secretary of Energy Moniz. These are the first employment numbers in energy that are reasonably accurate in every sector. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistic numbers, they're wildly off for every sector, not just efficiency and renewables and things people think about in that category, but in nuclear, in power plant operation. We don't understand the workforce that we need. We're finally getting those numbers after decades, and that's having a big impact on state policies and workforce development, having a big impact on companies that tell us the biggest impediment they have to advancing technology, to advancing in this area, is workforce. So it's another key component. And I think the last item I want to touch on is just noting the coordination that we've had from a state perspective with the Government of Canada, with international companies, also with other exchanges we've done with France, with China, on efficiency programs, on renewable programs, joint R&D activities. We haven't seen that at the federal level. We do see it at the state level, and I think it's very heartening. But on the major issues we have, whether it's something to address adaptation at ports, as was just discussed, we have to have that collaborative nature. We can't do this alone. But I think it's the clean tech activities we see at the state level, supported by the combination of policy, some investment. Frankly, I think the private sector investment is probably adequate in that regard, but more the policy alignment and bringing that together at the state level, at the regional level, and hopefully a little bit more coordination with the federal government in that regard. I hope will push us over the finish line. We're optimistic about that. And last two things I'll lead you with are just some glimpses of federal policy for the reason that I am optimistic. Last year, we saw the passage of the Disaster Reform Recovery Act. Something nobody really noticed, frankly, but it's a huge amount of resources every year that go to disaster recovery and rebuilding. Until last year, we had to rebuild, whether it was a structure or whatever it was, to the standard that it was originally built at. So fairly ridiculous idea. You take federal dollars, you have a house that isn't built well, and you rebuild it not well again. Doesn't make much sense. And that applied to infrastructure broadly writ. So that has changed finally. Congress voted that out, bipartisan basis, President signed it, all is good. The other aspect to that was a pre-disaster mitigation fund. We used to not plug the holes in the bucket in energy infrastructure, physical infrastructure before a disaster, and we'd pay more for it afterward. Now, roughly $1 billion a year starting this October will go out to the states, to the emergency management agencies to undertake infrastructure projects of all kinds intended to be more resilient. Finally getting the message that maybe we should do some investment before things happen. It's a good sign. Congress understood, Republicans and Democrats, what they were doing, and that climate was a part of that. They didn't say it very much, but they knew it, and that's why they did it. So it's a bit of optimism. We've also seen some changes to the flood insurance program along the same lines by the Trump administration in the last 6 weeks. Again, I think a heartening sign to at least we're beginning to address some of the problems. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I hope you're glad all of you stayed here this long to be cheered up a little bit now that we got to this panel. So let me turn now to Grant.
Thank you very much, Dick. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for taking some time to be with us today. I enjoyed our last speaker up here. One thing Dick didn't mention about my background, I'm a Naval Academy graduate. My first summer cruise was a joint multinational exercise with the Canadian Navy off the coast of Washington State. So collaboration with our Canadian partners is something important to me, and I'm glad to see that's something that in this room we continue to develop and take forward. I'm the director of the Great Lakes Energy Institute here at Case Western Reserve. We are a energy research-related institute that helps support our faculty in developing partnerships, find research funding, and make their research programs even more successful than they already are. And I certainly, as I talk a little bit about technology and maybe build off of some of David's remarks and focus on opportunities, technology and emphasis in research and development is certainly one of the opportunities that I see. I do want to rehash some terrain that some of you have already covered this morning and earlier today. In talking about the science, I always think it's important to make sure that we're on the same page. I would like to focus a little bit on the Great Lakes region. That's certainly important to all of us here in Ohio and important to so many of our Canadian neighbors to the north. So what does the science anticipate to be the climactic changes affecting the Great Lakes region, for the next 20 to 30 years? And again, just very simply and hitting the high notes. More ice-free days on the lakes, and that certainly has economic impacts and opportunities for those who count on the lakes for moving goods and services. More rain for the region, to include more intense storms, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about that. We just mentioned flood insurance, and that's certainly something I'd like to spend some time on. We've seen the losses this past week in Nebraska and Iowa, especially with the flooding of the Elkhorn region and the impacts that we'll see not just on livelihoods, but on farming and what that means for agriculture and for food security and food supply. I think for our nations, and one of the important things that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about is the impact on the jet stream and more importantly, the disruption to the jet stream as we see that straight line that we knew growing up for so many years become kind of this wavy cosine or sine signature that is leading to incredible unpredictability in our weather patterns. So unpredictable frost freezes, the occasional polar vortex, this Pacific River, as some people have called it, that's pounded the West Coast this past year. Nationally, we'll continue to see a drying of the U.S. plains in the Southwest. Water will increasingly become a scarce resource in parts of the country, and that may create economic opportunities for the Great Lakes region as we talk about economic opportunities as part of this panel. So it's the unpredictable nature of our weather patterns, which is certainly one of the challenges that we face, and certainly one of the challenges that we'll need to be reconciling with as part of what we might call the new norm. I know a lot of what David just talked about are the investments that we're taking to try to mitigate against climate change right now. I hope we continue to take those actions and invest more, frankly, in those actions. But I do think it's important that we also start investing in adaptation and that everyone understand that so much of the warming that we have already experienced is baked in. And by baked in, meaning, when you look at where the warmth has gone, it's in our oceans. When we look at changes in temperature with that warmer ocean that we have today, it's going to take a long time to with any amount of mitigation to see a stop in the rise of CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere. So again, addressing adaptation to me is an important topic. Moving on to some of the economic issues, again, a panel on economics, strategic thinking, risk. So we've talked a little bit about flood insurance, and I do think thinking about flooding as a new norm and something that we'll be talking about much more regularly in this part of the country is something that I hope we move into panel conversations and we start addressing with more regularity. The question really becomes, if your property floods 3 years out of every 20 instead of one out of every 100, what is the floodplain? And whose responsibility is it to address that? And who is addressing that? And it leads to this really interesting intersection of responsibilities. At the local government level, it's your county engineer, an often ignored, in most places elected position that most political parties have not paid a lot of attention to, and are just starting to realize that that is the person who ultimately decides whether or not you're going to be able to build in a certain location or not. At the federal level in this country, there's pressure from FEMA to say, wait, you can't build here anymore. The riparian designation for this stream or creek or river needs to be amended based on what we've seen for the last 10 or 20 years. This raises some exciting questions especially for the legal community. If FEMA or your county engineer decides that the piece of land that you bought to build a nice, whether it's a development or a supermarket on, is not buildable because they're changing the floodplain, is that taking your property in some respect or impacting its economic value? And if we start to see whole-scale changes to the floodplains, what does that mean for real estate or for other purposes? Again, if your property floods 3 years out of every 20, if you're the property owner, do you want flood insurance? And if you are the insurance company, do you want to offer that insurance? And I think, I think these are very important questions that we all should be talking about much more frequently. And I expect if you are the property owner, the answer is yes. And if you are the insurance company, the answer is maybe or no, but maybe at the right price. So these are important changes that are coming. The same thing can be said for agricultural or crop insurance. Again, if your farm is flooding 3 years out of every 20 instead of 1 out of every 50, are you as a crop insurance broker or crop insurance provider going to sell that insurance? And I think it's a great question that we need to look at. And it certainly starts to speak to the vulnerability of our agricultural lands, both from flooding, as we've seen this week in Nebraska, as well as to drought and to drying, as we're seeing in the areas above the Ogallala Aquifer, which, depending on who you talk to, has got 20 to 50 years of water left. Not enough for the youngest people in the room, and that's for sure. And if you look at the drought conditions on the West Coast, those are expected to continue. Obviously, this year's been quite wet, but long-term trends suggest increased drying out there. Again, when we talk about economic opportunities for this region, obviously Canada and Ontario in particular is known for the greenhouse growers in this region. That may continue to become a greater opportunity to provide produce for the Midwest and the East Coast, and maybe in a new opportunity for Ohio greenhouse growers and other growers around the Great Lakes region. We've talked a little bit about offshore wind, especially the opportunities that we're seeing explode on the East Coast of the United States. Great Lakes-based offshore wind may finally be harnessed and may lead to increased opportunities for Canada-U.S. cooperation on this front. Certainly something that at the Great Lakes Energy Institute that we've been involved in from some of the research and development aspects of putting these structures into the lakes and what kind of structures would anchor the turbines to the sea floors. On the R&D and T's research, development, and technology front, I do think that continued investments by both our governments, by the venture community that we'll hear about here momentarily, are important opportunities. I do think that we are looking to the technology community, to our engineers, to help develop solutions to some of these most pressing problems that we're facing. And part of what's exciting is that some of the investments that we've already made are starting to reach the kind of maturity that we need to provide a runway going forward. One of the success stories that I think we've seen here in Ohio, First Solar has a lot of their U.S.-based manufacturing in Perrysburg, Ohio, over in the Toledo area. They are a manufacturer of rigid thin-film solar panels. They're on pace to build over 5 gigawatts of solar panels this year, ramping up to 10 gigawatts within the next 4 to 5 years. Almost like some of the aircraft manufacturers, they have orders that they're sold out for the next 2 years. So it's exciting to hear that the technology is that mature and that investors have that level of confidence that we're buying and installing at a very, very high level. Again, for scale, Davis, Bessie, or Perry nuclear power plants here in Ohio, each of those is about 1 gigawatt. So we're seeing 5x of one of those being installed annually, just from First Solar alone. The last thing I'll mention is some more of these risks. Again, in the Great Lakes region, as we talk about warming water and some of that warming being baked in, obviously we've talked a little bit about toxic algal blooms in Lake Erie and how that impacts our water supply. Again, there's other economic impacts of that. Obviously, Lake Erie is known for boating, for recreation, for fishing. It's a $1 billion+ industry, as we're reminded in Ohio all the time. And if the water is filled with green goop, people are not fishing for walleye. They're not going to the parks and to the beaches in the summer on either side of the lake, and certainly something that we should be concerned about. I do think there's opportunities. I know we have friends from some of the Great Lakes organizations in the room. These are operations for greater cooperation between our countries that we should certainly invest in. But looking forward to having a robust conversation about these or many other topics here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Before turning it to Carlos, I want to make a personal comment here. When I told my wife I was coming to Cleveland to participate in a climate change program, she thought for a minute and said, well, let's see, we've got a beach house on a barrier island in the Jersey Shore. Our 2 grandchildren are in Portland, Oregon. We just bought a small condo, which is right on the edge of the river in Portland, Oregon. Well, thank God our home is on a high hill just outside of Washington, D.C., because it may be the only thing we have left. So pay close attention at the conference, Dick. So let me turn it to you, Carlos. Let's talk about what's going on with business, and particularly with the entrepreneurial side of this whole equation.
Great, thank you, Dick, and thank you everyone for having me today. My name is Carlos Massery. I'm a low-carbon entrepreneur from Canada. I have Latvian roots, so that plays out in a lot of how I feel about as an oppressed former group from the Soviet Union. But what I do in my day-to-day is create and breed clean technologies. Between me and my business partner, we've raised over $250 million for 6 different ventures. Those are Canadian dollars, so the North American peso, as we call it. But we've brought 4 of them to commercial revenues. We've sold 2 of them. We bought 1 of them back, and the last 2, I'm currently CEO of one of them, and he's CEO of the other. Climate change is near and dear to both of us. My business partner did serve in the Canadian Army in the Armed Forces. In his mid-20s, he was diagnosed with leukemia. And while he was recovering, he came to the idea that he wasn't in the business of defending someone else's oil. He wanted to make his own. And that's his lifelong learning. He's been my mentor and started off as my CEO, and then eventually became my chairman, and now we're business partners. Climate change, I hate the term. I think it's a suitcase term. It's got too many meanings, depending on who you're talking to. And it plays to your conscience, it plays to your emotions, it plays to morality, it plays to thinking, and unfortunately also it plays to political discourse and the tides of changing political environment. If someone asks me, do I believe in climate change, I refuse to answer the question because it legitimizes that climate change is still a question. If someone asks me, do you believe in climate change, I ask, do you believe in protecting water that you drink? Do you believe that you want you and your kids and your grandkids to breathe smog? On a more tangible economic level, I ask myself globally, do we have enough resources to feed the world? Do we have enough resources to bring the rest of the world to the living standards that we all want to see the world live in? And at the end of the day, if someone's still really stubborn with me about that, it's all back to markets. I mean, the first presentation this morning, you see temperature like this. If that was a stock, and every single analyst on Wall Street is saying, buy, 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 because everybody is seeing that that stock is still going to go up by 1 to 4 Celsius over the next couple of years, you're going to buy that stock. And frankly, if you wanted to bet against that stock, Shell is selling its refinery business. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is getting out of early stage exploration. And if you really want to go for it, there's a whole bunch of coal plants for sale across the US. So that's how I kind of view climate change, but so I don't see it really as risks anymore. It's more about what are the hurdles preventing us from now overcoming the policy discourse and the business discourse that is preventing the advancements we're looking for. The reality is, oil and gas is the biggest industry the world has ever seen. It has captured regulation and regulatory bodies at every level of government around the world. So how do you deal with that? It's a big question. I mean, yesterday's question of, are we waiting for events to happen? Well, we've seen events happen, but they're not happening locally for the most part, or at least they're not happening in a way locally that's really making us want to do anything differently. You look at the insurance industry now. There's places in the U.S. that you can't get insurance for your home, particularly in Florida. You're seeing these massive floods out west that are going to need bailouts at the federal level if we're going to allow these people to live. We still see a huge disaster in Puerto Rico from one of the gravest hurricanes ever to hit the island. So these are events, but it's not helping. It's really not helping. So we've got a lot of lawyers in this room. So what do you do in this sort of place when you look for cooperation? Well, you look for precedents, like, right? I guess that's what you guys are supposed to be researching all the time, is precedents in this sort of world. The reality is, most of the precedences in climate change and precedences in making good work happen by accident or happen by opportunistic industry. For one, we look at the Montreal Protocol, one of the greatest legislations that was written to protect the ozone layer. It's a very foreign concept to many people that there's a hole in the air, and nobody really understood it, and it failed a couple times. Why did it end up working? Well, Dow and DuPont had an HFC. Nobody else had an HFC, so they were more than happy to help eventually phase out and ban CFCs, because that gave them a competitive advantage over their global peers. The next one is the German feed-in tariff. It's currently burdening the German economy with over $100 billion of additional cost to bring electrons to the grid. How did this happen at such a massive scale? Well, Germany had the same problem as the US. They were going to lose manufacturing to the Chinese. If you look at manufacturing as a percent of GDP, Germany has been at 20% since the early 90s. The US was at 20% at that same sort of period. Germany is still at 20% manufacturing as a percent of GDP, even though their cost and labor rate is higher than that in the US. Since then, the US has dropped to 12%. So the German government was more than happy to help recreate industry. They took advantage of the German Black Forest was also acidifying. They took advantage of time in nuclear uncertainty. And meltdowns around the world to scare the population into action. But they also have a different form of government, that they get a level of proportional representation. So once a Green Party was able to join a coalition government, they pushed for more of these tariffs. The other reason that it worked in Germany is that lobbyists, you lobby differently in Germany. Here in the States, you can independently, as a company, hire lobbyists and go talk to a political figure, whoever you need to, or a bureaucrat. In Germany, the government will only talk to industry associations. And so the Industry Association for Utilities was actually quite disorganized. They didn't have a counter plan to deal with this. Very different in German cars. If we think the Germans are so progressive with regards to their environmental regulation, not true. Look how far behind they are on electric vehicles. It's because the German car industry is very organized, and they certainly protected themselves in the grounds. China, again, they did exceptionally well in their solar and wind development. Why is that? Well, we had a huge recession globally in 2008. They decided that they were going to invest in R&D. Chinese have no idea how to do R&D for multiple reasons, mostly because they like stealing other people's R&D. But so at the local level, people still have economic targets. The local governors had economic targets. They took R&D and they built factories. And they justified, we need a full-scale solar panel manufacturing facility so that we can figure out how to make them cheaper. Well, it played off to the local industry's incentives, but it did drive the cost of solar down tremendously as a result. So, and the last one, which I'll touch upon, which is kind of the world that I live in, is biofuels. Biofuels, of course, did have a lobby here, which was first corn to make ethanol. That is a different industry than mine, but when that first came out, it was, you could comply or industry could pay a fine. That worked for corn because they had other markets for corn. When biodiesel came around, they said that's not going to work for us, because if oil and gas can pay to get out of compliance, they may not do it, and we don't have secured demand. So in Ontario, lobbyist by the name of Bliss Baker, a good colleague of mine, he actually lobbied and eventually changed the Clean Air Act and made CO2 a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. That made it illegal not to comply with blending mandates. Back to an earlier question here of how do you get directors involved on a legislative basis, a very clear, very good example of how you make that happen. Biodiesel has since expanded, ethanol has expanded. They live under the umbrella of oil and gas, but they don't need to compete with oil and gas. It's still more expensive to create a biofuel than it is a traditional fuel because there's no price on pollution for the most part. So if you can do that, all the players in the biodiesel, all the players in the renewable fuels business, it's not about outcompeting oil and gas. It's just about outcompeting your peer. There's a famous example of, if there's a bear chasing you, you don't need to outrun the bear. You need to outrun the guy next to you. But there is a policy evolution here, and I think this is most important for policymakers, is it's okay to make mistakes at the right time. The original biofuels legislations were not great. They weren't perfect. We continue to modify them. The US has introduced in CARB and the low carbon fuel standards that it's not just a renewable fuel, it's how much carbon reduction your fuel delivers that is becoming more of the market. In the States, you have RINs. That's different in Canada. You can only make your blending mandates by actually purchasing the fuel. In the States, you can buy the credit, not just the fuel. It makes it easier to comply. It's a more efficient market mechanism. People are continuing to change how they make these policies work. It's not written in stone. These things have to be figured out over time. They have to modify as we learn and see how industry is reacting. What's the future of this? I am an optimist in this sort of thing. My girlfriend thinks I'm a horrible pragmatist and borderline realist. But if you look at where the world was a couple decades ago, the world was surrounded with famine. The world was impoverished by several billion more people than they are today. And now, a couple decades later, we have relatively good living standards around the world. Climate change, I think, and the topic of a transition to a low-carbon economy is next on the list here because there's a critical mass in the world now that finally has the luxury to pay attention beyond food, clothing, and lodging for themselves. I see the future a little bit differently in terms of how climate change happens, and it has to happen because we have mitigation and adaptation all happening at the same time. We also still have a major component of cybersecurity going on the global level, and we have terrorism on a very localized level, and that can be delivered in vessels that were not imaginable decades ago. So I see the transition to a low-carbon economy as small scale. If you look at Shell just announced last week that they want to be the world's largest producer and distributor of electricity. They see the world in decentralized local grids. Makes for a huge challenge for an industry like nuclear or any sort of large power plant if you now have to be responsible for the grid around your asset, and that grid is getting hit with freezing rain every year, with windstorms, with thunderstorms. Up in Muskoka, or maybe in parts of Michigan, when you get these wild thunderstorms all summer long and you're out of power, you look at the cottages on the lake, they're still powered through then. They're on the Tesla battery pack and they have solar panels on their roofs. I also see the transitioning happening at cities first. Climate change you have to see for it to work. People in cities, you're just closer to the problem, and with that, you're closer to the solution. Cities also tend to have the type of population that wants to see it happen faster. And capital, and this is the toughest part of the market, the capital chunks that go out to these projects are small scale. I can talk to the Canadian Pension Plan about any of the projects that we're involved in. They say, build 5, then come to us and prepare a portfolio of 40, then we will give you $1 billion check. But I can't do anything under $500 million. And you're like, the scale time, and again, it's the world's largest industry, but those are the actors that we have to deal with, and those are real constraints in our environment. But as a whole here, nobody, unfortunately, clean tech as a term has been soiled. If you want to do it, there's too many losses. There are too many early losses in the industry. We don't call it clean tech anymore. We just call it an energy efficient economy, a resource efficient economy. We're going to be resource efficient with the sun. We're going to be resource efficient with the wind, and we're going to be resource efficient with all of our existing processes to make our industry more cost competitive in a global context. If you sell that story at the policy level, sell that story at the industry level, well, now people are listening because it means more in their bottom line pocket. I also think, and I hope, without too much policy backfire here, that what we're really trying to do, and I don't see climate change as the biggest threat facing the world today. I see the disparity of wealth as the greatest threat the world faces today. And I do believe that if our hypothesis is true, that small scale is going to work, that small capital is going to work, and transition at the city level is going to work, I believe that it can lead to the wealth redistribution that this society needs to thrive and survive again. I believe that if we can find ways to produce energy and processes at a local level, you can reinvigorate the Rust Belt, you can reinvigorate Thunder Bay, Ontario, you can reinvigorate the Maritimes in a way that you can't do if we keep thinking that it has to be huge, it has to be made centralized, and we just need the rest of the world to buy our stuff. We have to teach people how to fish. So a little bit about Valent. We only go after the hardest problems of the world. Half of our carbon footprint is moving us around. We do liquid transportation fuels. If you look at the IEA standards, about 30 years from now, gasoline is supposed to drop by 25% consumption. But distillate being diesel, jet fuel, marine fuel, train fuel, distillate, and eventually the chemicals that are derived from it, are supposed to go up by 35% in terms of global demand. That's the market we focus on. It's the much harder market. We have proven pretty efficient to make good electrons, renewable electrons. We have not yet found a way to make good and renewable hydrocarbons. And that's what we focus on. So in conclusion, I believe that we have all the technologies that we need to achieve our 2030 targets under the Paris Climate Achievement. I think that that is a question of policy, not a question of technology, to achieve our 2030 targets. If we want to achieve our 2050 targets, though, we have 10 years of R&D to do, and then 10 years of field deployment to do in testing and scaling before those technologies are going to be ready. So we still have a dual problem. We need policy online to get the short-term goals, and we need business and R&D and government support at the basic science level in order to achieve our long-term levels. Thank you.
Wow, that was really interesting. Boy. I'm going to ask our panelists to comment on each other's presentations, but first I want to take the prerogative of chair and make an observation on this. We talk about this in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And I think you need to talk about a third thing, which is compensation. We heard, for example, earlier one of our panelists say that she got beaten to death working for a carbon tax, and it was called a job-killing tax. We've heard another panelist earlier today say that, well, you can't have, I think it was a gas tax, maybe a carbon tax, because it will hurt the people who have to travel substantially for jobs in the heartland of America and all that sort of stuff, whereas people who live in New York City walk across the street and don't travel for jobs. And what that says to me is that you have here the whole climate change thing as a policy issue and as a pragmatic issue is not conceptually different from the other elements of major rapid change that are happening to the economy and society today. I deal in trade a lot with the people who are concerned about technology change, that technology is going to wipe out jobs and people aren't going to have jobs. One of my clients has the story about what's the factory of the future going to look like. It's going to have two employees. It's going to be a man and a dog. And the man's job is to feed the dog, and the dog's job is to keep the man away from the machines. And the difference between technology and climate change is that there's I think an assumption almost universally shared that technology is just going to happen. It's not something you're going to stop. Climate change is something that's there. It's not only debated as to whether it's going to happen, but it's something we have to take action to stop. And the compensation flows from the action we take, not from the need for compensation for people who are losing jobs, things like that. Flows from the action we take, not from the change itself, from the climate change or the technology change, for example. And what it seems to me that you have to think about, and your comment on the Germans and how the German manufacturing employment has stayed at 20%, whereas the U.S. has gone down to 12, shows a country that has looked at it from that standpoint, which is that you have to deal with the change, but deal with it in a way that is holistic enough to affect both the prevention of the adverse, that it complies with the mandate to change, but also deals with the consequences on some group in society that are affected by how you deal with the change. And that's something we have trouble dealing with, in part because we deny that there is climate change, and in part because it's harder. I think it's intrinsically harder in the climate we live in today to say government needs to spend more money to do compensation for the change. So I think that I find the discussion, all three of these discussions in one way or another, sort of focused on that. And I find that very interesting. I'm not sure that I have the degree of optimism that we will address that, but it does clarify in my mind a little bit about how we need to address that. So let me ask each of you to sort of discuss a little bit what the others have said for a moment, to the extent you want to do so, and then let's have questions from the audience. So let me begin with you, David.
Sure. I guess a couple of things. I think the compensation comment you made is right on. I think, in my mind, that presupposes it is likely a federal climate solution. And again, going back to my crisis comments, although you would think we would be there, I don't think we're quite there yet at the federal level to have some kind of compensation scheme. It is just where we are. The other piece of that, though, is from a very narrow, either individual state lens or very narrow U.S. lens, the technology and economic element of this is what, in part, pays for that. That doesn't make everybody a winner, and it's very narrow in its view, but that is how you get from A to B politically, I think, with that. So that's one. It helps significantly, exactly. Right. And I think the other piece, though, is it's an unfortunate period of time. We have spent all the money as a country. So it's not as though there are many more checks that can be written. That's one piece. And the other part is, and you see it reflected in legislation that's being passed, either directly in this area or indirectly. I'll give you an example. The Obama administration, Republican House, Republican Senate, passed on unanimous consent in both houses reforms to the flood insurance program to make it market rate and to redraw the floodplains. It was in law and signed into law with full Democratic and Republican support for 6 months before it was rescinded. And it was rescinded because everybody who was in the floodplain lost their minds when they realized their home and condominiums and businesses would have lost a great deal of their value. So that happened and it was rescinded. And I think it's an example of we're not prepared for those shifts, the transition, the compensation, and you need the economic development technology to go with it in part, and it probably means a reordering of priorities. In that sense, I think it is one of the bigger challenges we have. It tends to be policy and economic. I think, much as was said earlier, it is not a technology problem in the near term, but it is this policy crisis. I think the state level, we see some of that. I'll give one example and wrap up. In Florida, they faced the prospect of no private insurance for wind insurance and hurricanes a decade ago. No private insurer, except Lloyd's of London, will insure a house in Florida for wind insurance. No private insurance, of course, for flood insurance, either one. So the state began ratcheting up building codes and standards. Every time there's a hurricane Category 3, a team goes out from the universities and they look at the building code, where did it fail, where did it work, and they ratchet up the standards again, and they call the insurance, the state-owned insurance company, and they make an assessment of what's done right and wrong. You buy a house, the company or the company that they hired goes out and looks at the house, see if you've made the provisions and your insurance is either very high or it's some measure lower. That's where we're headed with this, but it's about the compensation piece and readjusting where people live. I do not think it's going to be, there may be a lot of legal issues around it, but I think it's going to be driven so rapidly by the economics of flooding that it may be a moot point.
When there was an earthquake in San Francisco a number of years ago, I vividly remember Dan Rather, after the earthquake, interviewing the mayor of San Francisco and pointing out to him there were still being buildings built in San Francisco without earthquake reinforcement. And the mayor looked at him and says, well, Dan, you have to understand that our people would rather live a lifetime of fear in San Francisco than a lifetime of heavenly bliss in Sacramento. So let me turn to you. You next, Grant.
Dick, that's a tough comment to follow right there. Just to reflect on a few thoughts, I loved Carlos's point that cities and individuals are in many ways leading the charge to both mitigation and adaptation. We're seeing so many cities do incredible things as they are looking toward the future. They are designing adaptation plans. They are preparing for a warmer or weirder future for their inhabitants, and I think that's important. And I'd like to see more states give their cities the resources to act on those plans. And I think that's an area where we can see the greatest bang for our buck in terms of how we invest precious taxpayer resources into providing for a more secure future. On the individual side, I think it's really a great challenge and question. And you know, so many of us know someone who they put solar on their roof, they've got a battery in the garage, and they are looking to go off the grid. And this is something that I think in our two countries speaks so much to this heritage of self-reliance and individualism. But I don't know that that's a feasible solution for population as a whole, and that's where it's something that I think we need to evaluate. I do want to mention the Japanese example, especially as we start talking about liquid fuels as you know a huge need that we're looking forward to. So the Japanese right now are looking at the hydrogen economy as a potential path forward. And I agree with Carlos. We're talking about 20 years of intensive investment in RD&T and deployment if we're going to get to some kind of new energy future. But Japan, because of recent history, the Fukushima nuclear disaster and the typhoon that caused it, their lack of land, their lack of shallow water for offshore wind right now, and so limited access to renewables, a move by the population away from nuclear.
For companies like one of my previous ones, we raised capital for a company called Green Mantra. They depolymerize plastics and create waxes out of them, so it's actually an uptick of value. We picked Brantford, Ontario. Brantford, fortunately, is a city that was decimated by the loss of one of the largest tractor companies in the world. And we found a building, the Cascades, I guess, where they used to build egg cartons. Egg cartons are very energy intense electricity-wise. And when we looked at setting up our new process, our actual equipment was only $2 million. But when we looked at doing a greenfield site, we needed to spend $3 million on a grid connection. So we worked closely with the city of Brantford to secure this site. We were able to use their existing grid connection to drop our capital costs, also increase our timelines. Never mind as an entrepreneur to work in that sort of town. Policymakers, permitting agencies, everybody is on board to make that project work and make that project work fast. So I understand that a lot of these economies do not have cash, but let's remember they do have assets and they do have expertise.
So by my, actually it's not my watch, but the watch that's been loaned to me, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. Can I invite the audience to raise some hands and ask some questions?
What's the main technical challenge with hydrogen?
The main technical challenge with hydrogen, as we're looking at it right now, is making it far more efficiently. And then I would say it's building the infrastructure system to realize that at scale so that it could power infrastructure. So right now we're using essentially an electrolyzer, the reverse of a fuel cell, to make hydrogen as one mechanism for doing that. What we have seen suggested as a pathway forward is if you have curtailment in place, either with wind or with solar, where you're pushing too much onto the grid, instead of pushing it onto the grid, if you were able to, on site, use electrolyzers, essentially pull that electricity off grid into the electrolyzers, generate hydrogen on site, you can use that as long-term storage. And that's primarily how we're looking at it as a mechanism within the United States. That hydrogen then becomes fuel, chemical fuel essentially, that can be used for autos and for other purposes. again, the infrastructure for that right now is minuscule and not at the scale, not at the level of investment. And it's viewed as a competing future in the United States. So we have right now the pathway forward that's scaling is with electric vehicles. You know, we're seeing people saying we're going to go with chemically based, you know, lithium-ion battery storage for operating our vehicles as short-term storage for our homes. The problems for battery storage right now is you're looking at durations for storing electricity of somewhere of 2 to 6 hours maximum, and for your vehicle it's roughly a 250 mile driving radius. Hydrogen gives you more power, longer duration, but the infrastructure and the investment's not there. I also, I mentioned First Solar and their solar panels. I think a lot of people look at the electrolyzers and hydrogen-based PEM fuel cells that are in place as still being relatively early stage technology, and would like to see that advanced and see greater reliability with the systems before we start to see scalable deployment.
I'll add one more thing from the investment side. So traditional hydrogen is made by steam methane reformation. Sounds really complicated. Basically, you spend a lot of energy to activate some catalyst. You smash it with natural gas. The carbon is released and you have hydrogen. You have to do it at a huge scale. It's a $500 million starting point for a plant, and you cannot turn it on and off. What's the future of that? Well, one of the technologies we've invested in can actually do that same process using microwave technology. So we can take something the size of a pop machine, pop it in every single transportation parking lot, and when you need to fuel your vehicle with hydrogen, it can do that same process at a very local, small scale. The problem with hydrogen is that it's storage, transportation, and production. Are we still emitting? Yes, but we're doing it at half the emissions of traditional hydrogen.
Ambassador Blanchard.
Yeah, to David Terry, how many states in the U.S. have a renewable fuel standard, and what's kind of the range of what they're requiring these days?
Not many have a renewable fuel standard, as in liquid fuels. So think of some of the Midwest states for biofuels, but the federal RFS and RFS2 largely replaced that on the fuel side. On the electric side, about my last memory of that is like 38, 39 states have a renewable electricity standard of some kind. Pennsylvania, for example, is a clean fuel standard, which is a bit different. But renewable electricity standard, about 2/3 of the states, and then there are voluntary levels beyond that. That's really what's driven the renewable power market more than anything else. If you take that, combined with the federal tax incentives, which are largely in the process of phasing out, those have been the two drivers at work. I would say the third one, though, that's really interesting beyond the RESs as we think of them, is corporate buying. If you look at some of those states, certainly coastal areas, east, west coast, northeast, west coast, climate policy is driving that to a great extent. But many other locations, whether it's Facebook, Google, or Procter & Gamble, whatever major corporation it is that has a renewable requirement or sustainability goal, they're requiring that of economic development and job location in states, and that is a huge impact. I think it's really a combination of those three, and frankly, the federal tax incentive is at the tail end of that now. So lots of great progress. The liquid fuel side of the equation is quite different, however. I would say that the one follow-up on the hydrogen question, I think the relative infrastructure cost of hydrogen for light-duty transportation, it's very hard for me to imagine how we go from down that path versus an electric vehicle as we're starting to see them. It's just the cost is enormous. We have two states that are investing very heavily in that, California and to an extent New York, to a lesser extent New York, and the numbers are just staggering. I mean, I'm not sure how you get there in hydrogen infrastructure, but it's staggering. I mean, for light-duty transportation, it's really difficult to imagine, at least in the U.S.
Speaking of power sources that are pose difficulties, this one I'm about to talk about is at least a political difficulty, and you mentioned Japanese now are not interested in nuclear. And the Germans, of course, shut down all of their nuclear facilities. Chinese, on the other hand, as I understand it, are building new nuclear plants, specifically because that's a way they want to reduce coal. What does this panel feel about nuclear energy?
Happy to take that. We have, we don't have an organizational policy, but many of the states are very supportive of nuclear. I guess they come in two flavors. One, Ohio being one of them, Pennsylvania, New York, a number of other states that have enacted policies at the state level to compensate existing nuclear plants to keep them open. Part of that is jobs related, as much as it is reliability. I would say New York's a good example of that, is mostly about keeping the jobs in those communities. On the smaller scale, forward-looking side, we have a number of states, Idaho, Utah, most notably investing in modular nuclear reactor demonstrations. And those are quite promising. There are 3 or 4 companies that are furthest ahead. On the private sector side, Gates Ventures, Bill Gates Venture Fund has been backing NuScale for some time. So there are good opportunities there. I think there's a lot of receptivity to the new technology. The flip side of this, if you look at the plants in South Carolina and Georgia, the cost overruns on traditional nuclear plants, I think that pretty well closes the book. There's a lot of state-sensitive politics there, but the bottom line is too expensive and not enough future opportunity on the larger scale. Smaller scale, wonderful opportunities.
We have about 2.5 minutes left. Do we have any more questions out there? Our master, Steve Petrus.
Yeah.
This is a question first to David and then to the others. In the projects and initiatives that you see, how are they starting? Are they starting by the state energy officials coming up with the ideas, or is it private industry that has the idea, then they're looking for support?
I think it's largely private industry, and the only hesitation in my voice is there are broader policies, and good examples are when Minnesota and Iowa, the first 2 states that did wind resource maps, before there was even a glimmer in a federal person's eye about doing that on a national level. They saw entrepreneurs, wind technology entrepreneurs coming to their office, small companies heavily subsidized by state and federal dollars, looking for a way to deploy. And there were some smart state folks, and frankly, I think mostly career state folks at the time, that said, let's build the infrastructure, if you will. They did their wind resource maps or paid for them to be done. Universities did those, some help from the national labs. I think that's more often the case where you have some private entrepreneurs coming in, university R&D folks that have an entrepreneurial sort of edge coming into the state. They see an opportunity in the state, and the state begins to react. In a very probably micro level. We have a lot of incubators around the country, for example, that operate in that way. And then you begin to see some groundswell of support at the state level for a policy that somehow helps that along. And I think that's the more common one. I think it's very rare that it's the reverse.
Let me ask you about one method of financing things that came to my mind when you mentioned infrastructure. One of the things that is somewhat controversial in financing infrastructure projects is public-private partnerships. And the argument, as I understand it, is they appear to work as to a project, let's say like a toll road that produces a flow of income, but not like an airport which simply has to redo the runways and things like that. It would seem to me that a number of the projects here would generate flows of income that you could finance by public. Is there any interest in applying that sort of financing in this area?
Well, I mean, in the Canadian example, we haven't quite seen how it's going to work out, but the Canada Infrastructure Bank would be a good example of deploying that sort of level of capital. The problem is that so much of this infrastructure is a public good. So, at least on the Canadian side, I don't think that there's too much policy desire, at least, to have private hands in public goods.
Quick stab at that. I guess a couple of things. There are certainly a lot of public-private partnership examples in, I think, more conventional areas, building efficiency, energy savings performance contracting. It's a $5 billion a year industry there where you're using the efficiency savings to pay for it. I think the more interesting area that will have a bigger impact, and it is very thorny, and it's happening in roughly half the states, and that's really kind of reimagining what the electric regulatory compact is with the public. And it's complicated. If you think about, at least for me, the 2 most heavily regulated sectors of the U.S. economy, healthcare and electricity. And it's delivered a lot of good in both counts. But you have, at least in the electric sector, an onslaught, and in a good way, of new technologies wanting a piece of that. And we have to figure out how we're going to pay for the stranded assets that are left and for how that impacts people that have to pay for that. And a really fast example, if you're pulling people off the grid, the people that are left have to pay for the same infrastructure as they did before. Well, they're going to be paying more for it. And if you think of parts of the country where population is flat or down, and electricity demand is flat or down, likely down because of efficiency, good, waste reduction, variety of things, you have the same infrastructure to pay for. And that's a heck of a challenge for the state regulators. It's as big of a challenge for the policymakers, distinction between the two, governor, state legislature that has to decide, well, we have to wave our hands and decide what we're going to do about this that's positive. And I think that's the bigger public-private partnership opportunity, but incredibly complicated. And my hat's off to the regulators if there are any. I know there's at least one in the room to figure those things out, because it is not easy.
Well, we're right at 2:30, the termination time. I would like to say thanks to a terrific panel. This was really interesting stuff and stuff that I mostly had never come across before, and let's give them all a big hand.